Hey guys, welcome back to Community Starcraft 2. I'm your host Magnet, and as you can see on the screen today, today's lesson is regarding PvZ, unit compositions, and micro. I'm going to be taking you guys through a few different really common unit compositions that you can find in PvZ and show you the ways that you're supposed to micro them in various game situations. We're going to be covering quite a bit in this video, and it's going to go by pretty fast. You can always go back and watch parts. You may need to look at it again for the quicker micro stuff, but let's go ahead and jump into the game. We can see that here I'm running games in the unit test map, which is basically a map that allows me to build whatever I want. So I'll just go ahead and make whatever. As we were talking about before, if you remember from the card, the first composition we're going to be talking about is the macro Stargate, and typically that's going to involve a lot of void rays. And void isn't a word, but we're going to start off with a lot of void rays, and we're going to tell you guys how to support this properly when you get into fights. So we'll start off with just a handful of void rays and some sentries, which is really common. And the rest of your supply is usually going to go into zealots, as you can see here. So this is a really standard start for this composition. Eventually you're going to have to get into some other things, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. But we need to also make sure that we are balancing these battles properly. You notice me just kind of randomly clicking around on my void rays here. But the upgrades that you need to make sure that you get for this, which we will show in just a second. Well, actually, let's go back over to the Zerg base and make sure we're producing out some units. Now, normally we're just going to start out with Roach Hydra in all these battles, considering that's the most standard Zerg composition, and most of these builds are kind of built around whether or not you can survive the random timings that come out. You can see for the Zerg we're getting upgrades like 1-1, Hydra speed and range, Roach speed as well, and we're just going to have these guys fight, and we're going to make sure that you guys understand what's going on in these. So, let me make sure I'm not actually forgetting anything. I'm just trying to balance out these armies to make it semi-realistic so these armies are fairly equal. What you really want to pay attention to, though, is make sure your army is all attacking in the ways that they're supposed to. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to attack the Zerg army in here. On my side, I'm going to drop a couple of Guardian Shields and force field off and make sure you hold position on the back of your army so that the back of his army is only hitting Zealots. And Zealots dying in this is just fine. You can see the micro still coming down just a little bit. And now I know that there's only a few Hydras left. If I can kill those, then the rest of this is easy cleanup. I am losing my sentries in the background, but pretty much after the first fight, it's not that big of a deal. So you can clean up with Void Rays, as you can see there, so that's all taken care of. Later in the game, you're eventually going to want to get into Templar tech. So I do have a lot of Templar here on the field, and I will have Storm Research and show you guys the way to properly engage with this. And what I'm doing now is I'm actually just putting the Templar out in front. And the reasoning is that you want to put some damage on this army before it actually gets to your base, or rather before it gets to your army if you can help it. So just going to kind of pull a Templar forward, land a storm, make him have to walk through it if he wants to fight me, and then now we can go, and I'm going to storm all over this and make sure I'm controlling my Templar throughout this so that I can storm on top of the Hydras. Again, if you kill the Hydras, you kill the army, and of course make sure you merge any archons that you might have sitting back behind. So Void Ray is still on the field. Great, you won that battle. The next composition you might see is something like Ultralisks. Ultralisks are often supported by Hydras, considering they do need to check against your Void Rays, but this can be pretty hard because the Ultras can chew right through your Templar. And if you lose your Templar, you're basically dead. So we're going to show a good way to engage most of this army. You'll notice my Void Ray count is higher because it's supposed to be kind of later in the game. So he attacks in, I'm going to charge out my Void Rays, and I'm going to target down each individual Ultralisk and kill as many as I can before my Zealots die. Now the Hydras are hitting my Void Rays, I'm going to fall back, I'm going to land some storms on the Hydras, land another layer of storms, and now the Hydras are all red and basically dead. I can re-engage, Void Rays clean up, GG. Finally, we're going to get into some other situations where you may be fighting things like infestors as part of the composition. And this is a little self-explanatory. You'll notice that you can just put your Templar forward once again, and what you really want to have is some sort of spotting so you can see his army. So if you ever see him not really paying attention to his army, just kind of standing around, send a Templar forward, and if your Templars are fully up with energy, you can actually kill 4 infestors with feedbacks before he'll even be able to do anything about it. And if you can reduce the infestor count, all of a sudden it's basically like the fight before, except for you have a lot of Templar energy, and he doesn't have very much infestor energy. You can see there's only 1 Templar there. I just go ahead and feedback it. And you can be pretty liberal with the storms. Once again, the only thing that matters as far as surviving is the Void Rays, because everything else is really replaceable. And we'll just go ahead and burn those down. So the second one we're going to take a look at is the robotics and support strategy. So that's basically like using a lot of robotics units, and the support that's being folded into that is really important as well. And I just realized in the previous battles I actually never got any Protoss upgrades, and you really will want +1 air, +1 shields, and Zealot charge, and Storm, of course, in the previous set. But in the Robotics one, which we're taking a look at right now, obviously it's going to revolve around Colossus, but they're not super accessible in the beginnings of the game. So we'll start off with a couple of Mortals, some Sentries, some Stalkers, and we'll make sure the sides are both fair once again. So we're going to start with about 6 Sentries, and I'm not going to go with Colossus right away. Of course, we do need to populate the Zerg army, and once again we'll just start with the standard Roach Hydra. But this is going to kind of scale into the later stages of the game. You're not going to have Colossus right away, but you will want Immortals right away. So we're going to start off with just a few Immortals and pull the Colossus back for the time being. So let's move these guys out of the way. And the support is really important in this. It's not like it's just Storms and Void Rays and stuff like that doing the damage. All of your units actually matter in this type of composition, so you need to be able to preserve all of them as accurately as possible. So you can see me rallying all my stuff forward here, and we'll just fast forward just a little bit into the video, and we can see that I do have a lot of sentries hanging out, some decent energy counts on there. The Zealots almost don't matter, but the rest of the army does. So what's going to happen is I'm going to make sure the upgrades are all good for both sides, make sure they're nice and even. And we'll just go ahead and attack in here as soon as we get a chance. So here we go. Just going to throw down the Guardian Shield. Going to split off half the army the best I can with the Force Fields. Did miss one on the high ground there. And you'll notice, look at all the units in the back that are not participating right now. Throwing down any extra Force Fields I might have to continue to segment the army the best I can. And if you're able to do that, and at least hopefully retain some units, some sentries, especially the Immortals are really important, and you can win these kind of mid-game battles. Let's continue on to a later battle. We can see that my sentry count is much lower, it's only 1, but I do have blink on my Stalkers now, and the whole idea here is, again, just to keep as many units alive as possible. So I'm going to continue to back up the units that are being attacked and try to lose as little as possible, especially the Colossus, but keeping the Stalkers alive is really important too. You can see if you can do that, you'll really just mash through the army quite quickly. So now, I'm going to simulate what it's like to go against something like Vipers. Vipers are kind of the same as Infestors were before, but specifically, if you lose your Colossus to these Vipers and they don't do any damage, your army is pretty bad. So, you need to make sure that you can find ways to feed back these Vipers before the fight starts, so you don't get your Colossus abducted. Even if you don't get them all and they can still pull 1 or 2 Colossus or something, then they can still do okay in the fight. You'll notice that I do lose 2 Colossus basically right away. But still, if your Colossus are able to get a decent amount of damage off, and if you feed back most of the Vipers, you should be alright. I should also mention something that's not shown in the video, is that the biggest thing to have with this type of composition, with Robotics as your main attack type, is attack upgrades for ground. Those are horribly important. You need to make sure you're staying on top of that as well. And in most of these battles, I'm either at +2 or +3. This time we're going against Ultras. I'm selecting all of my Immortals, and I'm making sure they all shoot an Ultralisk. So even if you have like 5 or 6 Immortals, just shoot the Ultra once and let the rest of your units kill it. You can see that you can usually just blow right through that. But the difference is that if I had Colossus and not as many Immortals, then I would have been in a lot of trouble there. So again, this is going by pretty quickly, so if you need to go back and check it out, then you can. The last one we're going to look at is Corruptors. And Corruptors are really not that huge of a deal against Colossus. The Colossus will still do alright damage. Make sure you get the Blink Micro in there as well. But the biggest thing is that you will lose the Colossus, yes. But the idea is that if you keep your support alive for long enough, namely these Stalkers, you'll be able to clean up the army, and in turn eventually clean up his Corruptors and not allow him to do too much after that point. So the next thing we're going to move into is what I call the Bully Zealot Archon build, which is basically relying a lot on Zealots and Archons being a big part of your army. And the ways you can support that are usually with Robotics units, sometimes with things like Void Rays, but usually it's better to go with something like Immortals. And you'll notice here the upgrades that I'm getting are +1, or rather plus attack and plus armor upgrades for my ground units. The Zerg will do something like 2-1, which you should be ahead in upgrades against this composition, no problem. And early in the game, you won't have a ton. Obviously, you'll have things like Warp Gates. We're going to go ahead and warp in some units here. Like we were talking about, most of our unit composition is going to be centered around Zealot Archon. You do want a couple of sentries, though, and I'll explain why once these battles start. The Archon's starting to come down now as well. I'll just put out 2 for the time being. Again, we'll usually start with smaller battles so that we can kind of scale it up throughout the game. And of course for Zerg, we're going to start out with the standard Roach Hydra, so we'll just go ahead and spam a bunch of those out. And not too much here, just to wait for enough of these to come out to make it realistic, or at least semi-realistic. The biggest thing that I'm going to be doing in these fights, though, is layering my army appropriately. So all these units are going to be kind of getting in the way of one another, and it's not like Void Rays or Colossus where they can just ignore positioning of each other because they can just kind of float over it or walk over it. Just trying to size out these armies, making sure they're appropriate sizes for this time of the game. Another thing you also will really want is charge. But what you want to do is lay down a Guardian Shield. Make sure your Guardian Shield is covering as much as possible, especially the Zealots, and make sure you're kind of bullying the Archons up there up to his army, so that number one, they're always doing damage, and number two, so that your units in the back aren't being bothered by the Archon's positioning, since they are huge. So let's scale up into the next part of the fight. Again, I'm making sure I'm layering my army as appropriately as possible, so the layering is Zealot, Sentry, Archon, Immortal, going back. And once we go, as soon as the Zerg army all rallies up, I'll make sure to spread these guys out just a tad. So once we go, make sure, again, the Guardian Shield is covering up your Zealots as much as possible, so micro your Sentries forward. And once the Zealots start to die, start to micro your Archons and get them as close to the army as possible. So just select your Archons, move them up here, and make sure that your Immortals can move around freely back there, otherwise you're going to be missing a lot of damage. So again, we can just kind of plow through that. As the game gets longer, though, you will want to start moving into things like Colossus. So you can see that I have a lot of Colossus here. The Zealots will still do alright, but the biggest thing is that once the Zealots wear down, they'll still at least kill some units, they'll take in a lot of damage, and after that it'll give the Colossus a lot of free shots, and the Archons a lot of free shots as well. So mixing in Colossus, maybe off of double Robo, is not a bad idea. Again, Guardian Shield, make sure your Sentry is covering as many Zealots as possible if you can help it. And then from here, you just need to make sure all your units are participating, which might work right there for some reason. But we pull these guys forward, and now you can see that the Colossus are basically burning through this army once they're able to participate. So the Colossus are really good to have in these kinds of fights. Let's move into a little bit of a different composition now, and I want to make sure that got all these right. I think what I'm actually doing is making sure that I do engage properly with the Colossus this time, so you can see what a dramatic difference that is if everything is not participating, and that's kind of the whole idea behind this composition. So making sure to position everything properly, layering it as appropriately as I can. We'll refight with basically the same compositions. Again, Guardian Shield, make sure to micro your Sentry forward to protect as many Zealots as possible. And now look at what a huge difference it is now that all the Colossus are participating. You're really just chewing right through the army, and you're making sure the Archons are up in their face so that if they try to retreat, they're going to take a lot of damage from it. Lastly, sometimes you're going to come across things like Infestors. If that's the case, you just really need to increase your Colossus count. So you'll notice I'm at 5, a lot less Zealots here as well. Infestors are a lot later tech, so if you need to just dump off Zealots and switch out your composition for something better, you can see you're still going to take damage from fungal and stuff, but since there's so many Colossus, it almost doesn't even matter. The Archons aren't even participating for most of this fight, and we're still going to crush through this pretty easily because of the high Colossus count. So, yeah. Again, I know these videos were really quick, and I'm just destroying my own stuff here for some reason. So I know these videos were really quick, but if you guys need to go back and check out any information that you might have missed throughout that, I don't blame you at all. You can always just check that out anytime, go back and rewatch it. In the meantime, go ahead and check out our sponsor, sc2replaystats.com, which is a really cool site for you guys to get some information on your own replays. They'll kind of analyze it and give you tips on how to play better. Besides that, stay tuned for some more videos, and I'll see you guys later.